What do you do when you have serious doubts about God? Can I have these doubts and still be a Christian? Do my doubts disqualify me? I have questions that need answers, but is it even okay to ask them? And what if I keep asking questions, but I never find satisfying answers? If you've ever thought like this message is for you. I'm Chris, I'm the pastor at Compass, and I am so glad that you are with me today. I have questions about life. I'm sure that you do too. Some of those questions are really small and kind of dumb, like if you try to fail and succeed at failing, did you fail or succeed? Or why do we say I slept like a baby when babies wake up crying all the time? Some questions are bigger. Why do I feel alone? Am I doing the right thing? Do I make a difference in the world? And then there are God-sized questions. Is God real? If so, does he have a purpose for my life? Why don't I feel him like I used to? And how can I know that any of this is really true? Maybe you've asked some of those God-sized questions, but maybe you were in a religious environment that discouraged questioning things. Maybe you never got good answers, and then those unanswered questions became doubts, and then those doubts became overwhelming to the point where maybe walking away from faith seemed like the only option. We are in a message series called Life After Death, and what we've been doing is looking at how Jesus' resurrection affected and impacted real people in the real world in different ways. And today we're going to look at some people who had significant doubts about Jesus and his resurrection. And some of these people were even ready to walk away. You may think that everything was peachy keen after Jesus rose from the dead. Everyone was happy and they were all like, wow, of course Jesus rose from the dead. He's Jesus. But the Gospels actually present a different picture. Look what happened when the women who Jesus first appeared to, look what happened when they told the other disciples about it in Luke chapter 24, verse 11. It says that they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. So when the women who saw Jesus told the disciples about it, the disciples didn't believe it. They had doubts about the reliability of both the story and the women who told it. And this isn't a one-off. Look at Matthew 28:17. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Some of the disciples still had doubts when they saw Jesus in person for the first time after his resurrection. There was one disciple in particular that we're going to look at today. And we're going to look at him to find out if our doubts about God are disqualifying or if those doubts can coexist with our faith. And so we're going to start in John chapter 20, verse 24. Now, Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." You know the saying, "I'll believe it when I see it"? I'm sure you've heard it. Maybe you've said it. But what that really means is this. It really means I don't believe it. I'm going to start getting up earlier to study. Sure you will. I'll believe it when I see it. This year I'm going to get in shape. I'm going to work out. I'm going to eat better. Yeah, you will. I'll believe it when I see it, because the only thing you're going to be working out is your couch cushions. When the other disciples told Thomas about Jesus, Thomas said, "I'll believe it when I see it." When Jesus is physically in front of me and I can see and touch his scars. Now, I don't think Thomas is genuinely trying to set up a time to examine the evidence, right? I think what Thomas is saying is, I'll believe it when I see it. Because he doesn't really believe it. Because he's almost ready to walk away. And this tracks because Thomas was a pretty pragmatic guy. Look at what happened during the Last Supper in John 14:3. Jesus said this. He says, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I'm going." And Thomas said to him, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Last Supper, Jesus is giving this moving speech about what's going to happen after his death. And the other disciples, they're just like soaking in the spiritual atmosphere, even if they don't get it. But Thomas is like, I'm sorry to interrupt, Jesus, but we don't know. Where is this place you're going? Thomas wasn't just going to buy whatever he was being sold. He needed it to make sense. And even when it did make sense, Thomas was a realist. When Jesus wanted to return to a town where he'd almost been killed so that he could see his dying friend, look at what Thomas said in John 11:16. Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." He's like, I'll go with you, but let's at least be honest about the fact that they're probably going to kill us and we're all going to die. Thomas was pragmatic. He was realistic. He needed things to make sense before he bought into them. And he had doubts that needed to be resolved. And he seriously doubted Jesus' resurrection. He literally said, "I will not believe. It will take more evidence to prove he's alive than you guys can provide, because we all know he died and dead people stay dead. We all thought he was the Messiah, but he died. We believed something that wasn't true, and I'm not going to make that mistake again." Maybe you can relate to Thomas. Maybe your faith was like your favorite sweater until it got snagged on a God-sized question, leaving a loose thread. And then once you started pulling that thread, the whole thing unraveled to the point where you just found yourself saying, "I will not believe." But that's not the end of this story. John chapter 20, verse 26, it continues. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, and he said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. You see my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." In spite of his doubt, Thomas was still hanging out with the other disciples, and Jesus appeared again in the flesh right in front of all of them. But he looked at Thomas and he said, "Thomas, if you wanted proof, here it is. See the scars? Go ahead, touch them. They're real. I'm real." And then Jesus said, "Stop doubting and believe." Some people hear that as a rebuke, as in stop doing the wrong thing and do the right thing. Stop being bad by doubting and be good by believing. But I don't hear a correction. I hear an invitation. You had doubts. You asked your questions. You tested those doubts, and I was happy to let you test them, Thomas. And hopefully, I've shown you that you can put those doubts aside and believe. And look at how Thomas responded after this in John 20:28. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." When he was allowed to ask his questions and express his doubt, Thomas believed. And not just that, Thomas the skeptic, the pragmatist, the realist, he was the first disciple on record in the Gospels to acknowledge Jesus as God. The guy who said, "I will not believe this resurrection stuff," was the first person to publicly acknowledge what the resurrection really meant. That Jesus isn't just a good teacher or prophet or even the Messiah. He is God himself in the flesh. Why does this matter? Because it means your doubts don't have to be the end of the story. In fact, your doubts may just end up being the beginning of something God is doing in your life. Your doubts may very well be the thing that lead you to say, "My Lord and my God." But how can that be? I've always been told it's a sin to doubt God, and asking questions is a lack of faith. How can doubt and faith be compatible? Well, I'm glad you asked. Look, what did Jesus do when Thomas doubted? He could have said, "Get out of here. You didn't believe I rose from the dead when you were told about it, and so you don't belong here anymore." But he didn't. Jesus could have said, "Your doubt is sin, and you need to beg forgiveness, and then maybe I'll allow you to be a disciple again." But he didn't. Instead, Jesus said, "I hear your doubt and I get it. But I'm right here, scars and all. Test it. Test it yourself to see if this is true." Jesus wasn't angry at Thomas's questions and doubts. He invited Thomas to test them. And why? Because Jesus doesn't discourage our doubts. He welcomes them. He's not afraid to be interrogated and questioned. He welcomes it. Look at 1 John 4, 1-6. John writes, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God, because many false prophets have gone into the world. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood." John said, test the spirits to see whether they're from God or not. And just to be clear, spirits doesn't mean angels or demons or ghosts. It just means what people are saying and representing about God. He says false prophets are out there saying things that aren't true. And then John invites us to test those things, to measure them against Jesus and the character of God, to know if those things are true or false. Translation: it's okay to approach everything you hear with a measure of doubt and skepticism, because knowing what's true matters. God doesn't want you to have blind faith. Blind faith is a great way to be deceived. He wants you to have informed faith, which is why he's comfortable inviting you to test everything, even the things that come from him. Look at how this played out in Acts chapter 15, verse 11. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed. Here in Acts, the people of Berea, the Bereans, they were celebrated not because they blindly accepted what Paul said without question, but because they tested what Paul said to see if it was true. They had healthy skepticism, asking questions about what they were hearing and testing it against what they knew about God. And they were praised, not because they believed with blind faith, but because their faith was actually formed and shaped by leaning into their uncertainty. Look at what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:20. He says, "Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all." Again, Paul says, I want you to truly know God and to understand the faith that we have in Jesus. So don't just blindly believe everything you're told. Test it all. Truth is there to be found, but only when we actively look for it and wrestle with it. Having questions and doubts is part of Christian discipleship. It's part of following Jesus, at least when we handle them the right way. So what is the right way? When we look at what Thomas did, I think that we can find three things to do when we have God-sized questions. And the first thing to do is to question with others. I think it's interesting that Thomas, who flat out said, "I will not believe," was still hanging out with the disciples who did believe. You'd think that when his belief was at a breaking point, he would have walked away from this faith community, but he didn't. He voiced his doubts in that community. If you have doubts, you need to do the same thing. The church is intended to be a community of love, grace, and acceptance. This is who you should be able to ask your questions with, without fear of judgment or reprisal or punishment. In fact, you may find your doubts being resolved by simply having a loving, inclusive community where you can express them. Maybe your problem isn't your doubt, but that you think the church is cold, intolerant, and demanding conformity. And if that's you, you need to lean into this community, believers, trusting that you will always be welcomed and loved in spite of your doubts. Or find a church community that will. The second thing to do with your doubts is to question God directly. He isn't afraid of your doubt. Jesus wasn't angry at Thomas for asking questions. He invited it. And then Jesus led the first century church to be people who kept asking questions, wrestling with their doubts, and testing what they heard. When you have God-sized uncertainty, the solution is not to run away from Jesus. It's to run toward him. And if you're still unsatisfied with those answers, that's okay. Many of the Bereans believed, but not all of them. God gives you the freedom to believe or not, but at least do yourself the service of bringing your questions directly to him. And the final thing to do is to question with an open heart and mind. Yes, Thomas said, "I'll believe it when I see it." But in spite of the intensity of his skepticism, when he saw Jesus, he believed. And then the greatest skeptic became the first one to declare that Jesus is God. It doesn't matter how deep your doubts or how big your questions, there is still space for them to be resolved if you just ask with an open heart and mind. But remember, there's a difference between testing something to prove it and testing something to disprove it. Be a prover, not a disprover. Skeptics test things to answer questions because the truth matters to them. Cynics test things to disprove them because they think they already know what's true. So be a spiritual skeptic, not a spiritual cynic. When you have God-sized doubts, question them with others, question God directly, and question them with an open heart and mind, with the desire to find the truth, not disprove it. Now let's wrap up with one final thing that Jesus said to Thomas in John 20, verse 29. Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." After Jesus lets Thomas test his doubts, he reaches forward through the centuries to us, to the people he's calling to follow him today. And we don't have the benefit of Jesus physically with us like Thomas did. Our questions have to be resolved differently because we can't see his scars and touch his physical body, which is why doubting in community, questioning God directly, and having an open heart and mind is even more important for us. It's also why I imagine that Jesus breaks the fourth wall in this story, turning his attention from Thomas to look directly at us and to say, "You're even more blessed for believing in me." If the hurdles to our belief are greater, they come with a promise from Jesus that the spiritual benefits are also greater. You can have doubts and still be a Christian. Your doubt doesn't disqualify you. It's okay to ask questions, any questions, even the scary ones. And even if you never find answers that are fully satisfying, Jesus promises that you are still blessed for your belief. So if you're wrestling with doubt, you're in good company. Thomas doubted, but he became the first to declare Jesus as my Lord and my God. Doubt isn't a disqualifier. It's an invitation. An invitation to live like Jesus lived, think like he thought, and do what he taught. At Compass, we believe that faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to follow Jesus in the middle of it. So bring your questions, bring your uncertainties, bring your whole self, because it's in the seeking that we often find the most profound truth. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.